and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. The American Constitutional Republic is a product of Enlightenment philosophy. The historians Will and Ariel Durant, in their magisterial Story of Civilization, deemed this period the Age of Reason. And yet, if we think about the campaigns, the narratives, and the efforts that just determine the outcomes of the recent midterm elections, we don't think principally first of appeals to reason. Instead, we think of appeals to passion. In this week's episode of Horns, Charles Zug, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and I might add, a graduate of the University of Texas, Austin, discusses the history of demagoguery in American politics. While some names such as Andrew Jackson or Huey P. Long come immediately to mind, Zug traces a longer, deeper, and more interesting history of this appeal to passion and unprovable motive principles in American politics and examines the implications of this strain of politics, which is particularly relevant as we take a look at the divisiveness and the issues that confront our nation today. This talk was recorded at the University of Texas, Austin.
I'm assistant professor at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. I've been there going on 2 years now. This book is a direct outgrowth of my dissertation. For any of you who are interested in academia or publishing books in a scholarly model, I'm happy to talk about that stuff as well. Any kind of professional development type stuff. We don't need to focus exclusively on the content of the book. So I'm going to describe what my sort of basic argument in this book is. I'm not going to take the full 45 minutes. I'd rather give you all some time to have a little back and forth and Q&A about stuff that you think is particularly interesting with this project or any related topics or stuff that's on your mind about contemporary politics. I'm open to all of that. So I'll just give you a kind of outline of the book. And I'll start by saying, how did I come to this subject of demagoguery? What was the sort of motivation or concern that animated the project from the beginning? Demagoguery always struck me, or insofar as I was aware of it, sentiently aware of it, struck me as a promising concept that was difficult to wield because it has an inherently negative connotation to it, right? So we can all think of concepts that are like this, right? You have demagoguery, populism sometimes gets used this way, communism, fascism, socialism, depending on what your political stripes are. These are concepts of, you might say, weaponization, right? People think that if they can apply it to someone, that will discredit that person politically, and we don't have to engage with the merits of that person's thoughts or arguments anymore. But all these concepts also, including demagoguery, have a kind of insight to them, right? They do describe some kind of phenomenon. Otherwise, we wouldn't be attracted to them, right? So, for example, demagoguery, we tend to associate with certain kinds of emotional or passionate rhetorical appeals, right? We might think of it as the speaker is demagogic, or the speaker provokes a reaction in an audience that's demagogic, or a speaker is motivated by a desire to gain power and they want to use provocative or emotional rhetoric in order to achieve that. Now, when you define it in some of those ways, it's understandable why people would think it's a negative thing, right? That you're trying to manipulate people, something that we're all subject to, emotional reactions to political phenomena. We're trying to manipulate those things for the sake of a bad end. But to me, it seemed like what was serious or core about the concept of demagoguery from a democratic standpoint, that is, from the standpoint of a society that we at least want to consist in free and equal individuals who can use their own minds to evaluate politics and make political decisions and participate in the political process. What seemed problematic about, or potentially problematic about the concept of demagoguery was that it disrupts our ability to reason about politics, right? That there's a kind of aspiration in democracy that we should be able to, all of us, weigh in on the political process in some way, speak out about it, think about it, that we shouldn't just be compelled by state action. And that the problem with emotional speech in general in politics is that it leverages evidence, you might say, that isn't accessible to everyone, right? A bunch of people might get excited or one person might get emotional, but we don't necessarily know what's motivating them, right? It could be a thing that just a kind of appeal that doesn't appeal to us. It doesn't make sense to us, right? People get excited, but for all kinds of odd reasons. There's no transparent rationale or argument for political action, justifying political action that's going on behind that kind of appeal. Now, by the same token, though, as we all know from our own personal experience and observations and studying politics from a variety of standpoints that we all do, that politics is not just reason, right? Reason is one, you might say, aspiration of politics. For example, we want public officials to actually have a plan when they do stuff, right? Or actually think through the consequences of what it is. Or when we cast a vote, ideally, I think we'd agree we want people to think about why they're voting, not just do it purely out of impulse. But by the same token, politics is motivated by a lot of passion, right? A lot of non-rational stuff, whether it's passion or complacency or, entrenched interests that we just take for granted. I mean, all of that stuff is sort of sub-rational, but it moves politics. And just because you make a deductive, reasoned argument doesn't necessarily mean you're going to actually get anything done. And it can also mean that there ends up being a significant gulf between the kind of reasoning you're trying to persuade people with arguments about why they should care for something or why they should prefer something, on the one hand, and the common good, things that we actually want done, right? Just because you stand up there as a professor and give a speech doesn't mean the country is going to move necessarily in that direction. And if you're not a skillful speaker, the likelihood is in a free country where lots of people are allowed to speak, you're going to get drowned out or you're going to get marginalized, right? That you're not going to actually make an impression on the political community. And so it was that sort of, with that tension, you might say, in mind, between the potentially positive but also negative effects of passionate speech or demagoguery, that I thought maybe it makes more sense to think about demagoguery as a kind of non-verifiable political argument that tries to achieve some kind of collective action, right? That tries to move a group of people, part of the public, in a certain direction. Maybe it's better, instead of thinking about it as an inherently bad thing, that we are therefore incentivized to use as a kind of weapon. Oh, you're a demagogue, we don't have to listen to you, in the same way that you use those other kinds of concepts, as something that could be used in better and worse ways, right? That could be mapped on to legitimate parts of political discourse or a political strategy. And so the question then becomes, how do you draw those distinctions in a non-purely impressionistic way, right? A non-purely subjective way, right? You just say, well, that sounds good to me, what they're saying, so I'm going to say they're a good demagogue, but I don't like them, I don't like the color of their hair or whatever, so I'm going to say they're a bad demagogue. And the argument that I sketch in the book, that I lay out in the book, and I'll sketch it here briefly for you, is that in order to be potentially good, legitimate, not necessarily good, because you actually have to evaluate the argument, but to be potentially good, demagoguery has to serve a supporting role to a reasoned account of the common good and for political change, a rationale, you might say, for political change. And understood this way, demagoguery is a kind of recognition of the difficulties of gaining traction and being heard rhetorically in a political community, and understanding that the aspiration, as I was saying earlier, is to actually reason about politics and persuade the public on the basis of reason, but that you can't always do that, right? You have to make compromises to the realities of a political world, an active and aggressive and oftentimes hostile political world. And so that you can deploy demagoguery, you might say impassioned speech is things that you can't necessarily verify through reason or evidence, in conjunction with that broader argument, and that constitutes a kind of model of excellence in democratic leadership. And so that's, you might say, the positive archetype or model that I try to sketch in the theoretical early chapters of my book, not even necessarily grounding it in any concrete examples drawn from American political life or elsewhere, but thinking about what that just as a sort of a priori concept might look like. I do other things in the book. I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A, but I'll focus mainly on two of the major claims I make in the subsequent chapters of the book, the less theoretical, more empirical parts. Now, I kind of whinge when I say empirical because people like my friends Henry and Kyle here do real empirical political science, and I'm just sort of like a dabbler. There are no numbers in my book besides the page numbers, for example. I do a sort of qualitative, normative kind of research using historical and contemporary case studies. And I'm happy to talk about the methodological stuff if that's of interest to any of you as well. So the second big question I had to ask myself is, given what I've sketched as a kind of normative ideal for thinking about different types of leadership in a democracy, how does that fit with a constitutional system, right? So I started with American politics because that's what I know best insofar as I know much of anything. I don't know much about other countries. And so, I didn't feel equipped to draw this kind of analysis in reference to other contexts. So I started with the United States and thinking we live in something that we call a constitutional democracy, right? With certain institutional attributes that differentiate that kind of system from different types of regimes, right? Purely authoritarian regimes where one person makes all the decisions, countries in which there is no sort of, foundational law or institutions. It's more or less worked out on an informal basis, discretion of a certain party or a certain class or whatever. The United States at least strives to be a constitutional democracy. For most of our country's history, we weren't. We sort of were, but power was more or less exercised by one specific group of people. We've made some progress in that direction. So insofar as that's the aspiration of our polity, of our regime, how should we use that insofar as it should guide our political judgments to think about leadership in the way I'm suggesting here? And I make two different arguments in this regard in respect to the American constitutional system. And the first one is fairly basic. It's that the Constitution is often thought of as a law, right? As something that just commands. Have two chambers of Congress, presidential terms for 4 years, the Bill of Rights, sort of legalistic commands. That's one way of thinking about a constitution, and there's something to it. But I argue, drawing on scholarship that's come before me, my mentors and advisors who've shaped my thinking, the constitutions go beyond that. There's more to designing and maintaining a political constitution. Constitutions, properly understood, are meant to achieve certain substantive goods, right? The preamble of the United States talks about justice and the general welfare and domestic tranquility and bestowing liberties upon our subsequent generations, right? Those are real life goods that the Constitution doesn't define per se, but it holds them out as goals that we should be seeking. Now, most of the Constitution is not the preamble, right? I mean, Kyle studied the preamble. I don't know how many words there are in it. But in reference to the other 7 articles of the original Constitution of 1787, it's a relatively small part. Most of the Constitution is procedure, right? It's structuring offices. It's telling people how to wield power, how they're allowed to get power, how they're allowed to run for elections, et cetera, how the states interact with the federal government. It's, I argue, best understood as supporting stuff. This was the drafters of the Constitution's best effort at giving us the institutional means, you might say, for achieving those aspirations, those general goods. And we can amend the Constitution through Article 5, and the fact that we're allowed to do that on the Constitution's own terms is a kind of invitation to say, look, if you think you can change these procedures and mechanisms in order to realize those substantive goods, if you think you can, for example, put a term limit of 2 terms on the presidency, and that's going to make it more likely that we achieve the common good, or you're going to get rid of state legislatures appointing the Senate and turn that over to the broader public, or repeal the various features of the Constitution that supported slavery, for example. If you think doing those things will get you closer to the common good, which is what the Constitution aims for, then you can do it, right? You have to get through certain procedural hurdles that you have to go through in order to pass a constitutional amendment, but you can do it, right? Now, connecting this to demagoguery, my argument is that you might think of political discourse as part of the recipe or ingredients for achieving the common good, right? People speaking out, making speeches, using speech to articulate alternatives of public policy, using speech to advance their own campaigns to get into a power, justifying what they've already done with speech. And so speech plays a kind of supporting role in all of this. And what I argue is that in the American constitutional system, demagoguery can be thought of as one of those many different means, discursive means, for achieving the common good under certain conditions. So, for example, when a marginalized group whose voice typically doesn't get heard for a variety of reasons, right? It might be institutional reasons. They've been excluded from the normal political process. They haven't been allowed to vote, maybe, or they're frequently denied access to the vote. And so that their impact on the political process is truncated or is less than it should be. Or ideational causes of resistance, right? Just prejudices, blinkered thinking that prevents us from fully grasping why this group that's marginalized, that's oppressed, might be suffering, right? What their needs are. Sometimes we just sort of take for granted the way we think about the country and what's good for the country. My argument is that demagoguery can be used as a way to potentially disrupt those sources of anti-democratic content, anti-democratic elements in society. And that's not to say that demagoguery can't be abused, right? You can always use the sorts of tropes, rhetorical tropes that I've talked about to advance bad causes as well. In some ways, I draw this analogy early on in the book, demagoguery is a little bit like violence, right? In the sense that we don't normally want violence to be a part of our politics. Ideally, we wouldn't transact politics that way, at least internally. But there are sometimes when violence is needed, right? Weber defines the state as a monopoly on violence. You need to use force sometimes. Otherwise, you wouldn't need politics. You wouldn't need laws. If the laws could just execute themselves, you wouldn't need an executive, a law enforcer. And so in some ways, demagoguery is a kind of, it recruits the sub-rational elements of our existence and motivation, potentially for the sake of good ends. But it has to be conjoined with a rigorous argument. At least that's my, that's the standard that I hold out. The second point I make about the American constitutional system is a little bit more sophisticated than the first. The first is really just ends to means reasoning, right? The second point I make is that the three branches of the United States Constitution, the offices that people the Constitution, that make it up, are each designed to perform distinctive constitutional functions, right? So sometimes when we think about this thing called the separation of powers, we think of it as just a means for making it harder for the government to do its business, right? Well, we don't want to consolidate everything into one Napoleonic mess, right? And so let's break it into three different things so that it's harder for the state to do stuff. And there's maybe something to that, though I think that if your chief concern was with frustrating the state, you wouldn't even have a state, right? Why would you design something purely to then make it harder for that thing to do its job? And so drawing on work by people in my field, including my advisor, Jeffrey Toulis, who builds this out at some length in his recent book called Legacies of Losing in American Politics, I argue that the separation of powers, the different offices of our government, are understood as making each a kind of unique contribution, bringing certain positive goods to the political process. And that's why they're designed in different ways. It's not that we just said, well, okay, we need to break this thing up, and then I guess we'll have a president with one person, and I guess we'll have a Congress with a whole bunch of people, and then a few people on the Supreme Court with life tenure. There's an actual rationale for having institutions designed that way. For example, as the Federalist Papers argue in the 70s, if you've read and studied the Federalist Papers, there's a reason why we want there to only be one president, right? We want decisiveness. We want secrecy, at least to the extent that you're able to achieve secrecy, right? If you're law enforcement, you need to be able to build cases and maintain national security. Heck, we're at the Clements Center, right? National security, you need to keep that stuff secret. Not everyone can know about your nuclear strategy or I'm speaking out of turn here. I don't know anything about these things, but there are lots of things you need to keep secret. Well, how do you keep a secret in Congress, right? Congress can't keep anything secret. So you design an institution as a kind of approximation of that constitutional virtue, you might say. Now, why would you want a Congress? Well, Congress is supposed to be, in some ways, more representative than the president, right? It's a whole bunch of different people drawn from different parts of the country, and even some areas of the country get a lot more representation than do others. In the Senate, every state gets 2 senators. Well, that means that Wyoming, which has about 700,000 people, gets a lot more representation than California does in the Senate. Now, there are reasons for that, right? You might say low density population areas are probably going to be poorer, right? They're not going to have the same influence on the rest of public life in the United States. And so you have to kind of institutionally build in ways that can leverage the system a little bit in their favor, as frustrating as that can be, right? Lots of people find the Senate very frustrating and would argue for a purely majoritarian system, right, where everything was done by means of ratios of population. But that's one rationale for designing institutions differently. I think the Supreme Court and unelected courts in general illustrate this point the best, right? Why do we not want courts to be made up of elected officials? Well, some places in the United States have elected courts, right? Judges who run for office. I think Texas has some of this stuff, at least at the local and county levels. And part of the reason is that we think courts should be protecting things, doing things that shouldn't just be up to majoritarian persuasion, right? Protecting someone's basic liberties, their basic rights, their habeas corpus guarantees, their First Amendment guarantees, shouldn't be something that a majority that goes to the ballot is allowed to take away, right? And so, again, as frustrating as courts can be, precisely because they're not responsive largely to public will, we nevertheless insulate them in order to make them more likely to resist public opinion and protect liberties, and also to fairly adjudicate disputes between people, right? You don't necessarily want the results of a contentious court case to just be a referendum vote, that the guilt or innocence of a person gets decided by a bunch of angry members of the public. We give that responsibility to courts and to some extent juries. Now, setting all of this up, my argument is that the nature and ends that these differently designed institutions are supposed to be pursuing means that the people who inhabit those institutions are supposed to speak in different ways, that we should judge their speech differently. Speech affects the ability of institutions and organizations to do things, right? If you go to a court proceeding or a funeral or a surgery and you start speaking in the same way that you speak at a UT football game, that's probably going to be inappropriate. And not just out of a sense of snobbishness. I mean, sure, there are elements of that, right? We just don't want people yelling and cackling necessarily. But also because those structures, those societal structures and organizations are performing different kinds of social ends, right? We're doing a very different thing when we're at a funeral and mourning someone's passing, or when we're at a court proceeding and there's a kind of legal solemnity to it. We're doing a very different thing when we're a part of that, when we're embedded in that social structure, than we are when we're at a sporting event, right? Our speech is contributing to the process in a completely different way. And so I argue that the separation of power system with these differently designed institutions can be thought of in an analogous way. And this is actually kind of intuitive if you think about it. Supreme Court justices get smacked around when they speak like members of Congress and presidents, right? So this happens, by the way, on both sides of the political aisle. One of the anecdotes I use from the book is from 2016, when the late Justice Ginsburg publicly came out against then candidate Donald Trump, right? And said, I think Trump is, a bad candidate or something to that effect. I think he's saying bad things. He shouldn't be president. The very liberal Washington Post ran an editorial publicly criticizing the relatively liberal Justice Ginsburg. And their argument was, look, even if we think the justice is right about this substantively on the merits, we agree, we don't like candidate Trump, it's not a Supreme Court justice's role to take those kinds of positions. Now, the Post didn't elaborate really why this is the case, what it is about the Supreme Court that means that its members shouldn't weigh in the same way that we would, of course, expect members of Congress to weigh in. Right? It'd be weird if a member of Congress didn't express an opinion on this kind of thing. They didn't lay that out, but I use that as a kind of jump-off point to say it's because, first of all, justices don't need to use political rhetoric to gain and maintain power, right? Once they're appointed, they're there. And unless they get impeached and removed by 2/3 of the Senate, and we've all recently witnessed how difficult it is to remove even an extremely controversial constitutional officer, they're there for good, right? Now, part of what that means is the kinds of tactics that politicians normally need to use in order to gain and maintain power, that a member of Congress needs to use in order to get reelected in their district. One of those elements is speech, right? We allow them to do that, so we think it's fine for them to use speech, even demagogic speech, in order to do their jobs, because their job in some way requires them to do that thing. Justices don't need that, right? They're there, they're secure. And so there's a kind of intuitive cap or limit that we all, I think, place on the speech of justices. This happened again a few months ago when Justice Alito, who's been very upset by all the criticisms he's been getting from the Dobbs thing, and is really making it publicly known that he's very upset about all these criticisms, gave a speech at a fancy gathering in Italy, saying that he more or less thought people should shut up about Dobbs, right? That, just kind of take it or leave it. And he got criticized for this, not only by liberals who were rightly concerned, but by conservatives who are saying, look, this is sort of violating the dignity of your office. Why are you speaking this way? So with all of that in mind, The third and final part of my book, the empirical part, is a series of case studies, or you might say illustrations of the theoretical point I develop in the earlier parts of the book that tries to tease out these kinds of distinctions with reference to office holders, historical office holders of the United States. And so there are 3 chapters, one on Congress, one on the court, one on the presidency. And within those chapters, I compare 2 or 3 examples and try to say, this is demagoguery poorly used, and this is demagoguery well used. And so I'll say just a little bit about the cases that I chose. So a case that I found interesting to a lot of people just because they aren't really familiar with this historical personage is that of Associate Justice Samuel Chase. Samuel Chase was appointed by George Washington, the first president. He went by the nickname Old Bacon Face because he tended to kind of whip himself into a lather and his face would get really red, and he was just a provocative guy. But he was also a really good jurist. He was a really smart thinker, and he was involved in a lot of early sort of foundational Supreme Court cases. So he kind of captured the thing that I'm talking about here, the emotion coupled with a kind of reasoned basis. During the election of 1800, a very controversial election which witnessed Federalist incumbent John Adams square off against Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson, 2 radically different visions of the country. The country was extremely polarized around this. Didn't help matters that the election went to the House of Representatives because no one was able to get a majority in the Electoral College, and it was a big, awful mess, and no one wants to relive that, right? Chase, Old Bacon Face, was a vehement Federalist, a vehement Adams supporter, and he, being a Supreme Court justice, took to the streets and openly campaigned for Adams. Not only did he just openly support this guy and try to throw his weight as a justice behind Adams's candidacy, he also would stand up during actual litigation when he was serving as a judge and tell the jury how to vote. This person is guilty. This person is innocent. Not stuff you generally want to do as a judge, right? That you're supposed to facilitate blind justice. There was no blind justice going on in Chase's courtrooms. He felt very strongly about who should win and who should lose. Unfortunately for Chase, Adams ended up losing the 1800 election, as we all hopefully remember. Jefferson came in and he was not exactly pleased that one of the court's justices had been openly campaigning against him for the other guy. And so impeachment charges were voted on in the House and approved, and there was an impeachment trial in the Senate. And the question there was, essentially, was Chase a judicial demagogue, right? Had the speech he used, was it punishable under the impeachments clause of the United States? There were several other charges too, but the charge that got the closest to actually getting surmounting the 2/3 hurdle in the Senate was the speech charge, that he was a demagogue. They didn't quite get there. They were only a few votes off. They almost removed him from office on the basis of his speech. But I look at this as a kind of helpful illustration of the problem that comes with demagoguery on a judiciary, right? If a Supreme Court justice really believes and thinks they have sufficient reason to believe that a presidential candidate, by the way, it's interesting that the Ginsburg case and the Samuel Chase case both concerned a presidential election, right? What they took to be a particularly momentous presidential election. Is there a rationale for why an unelected justice should nevertheless be allowed to intervene on that process in a particularly demagogic or provocative way? And I come down on the side that in the case of Chase, the argument that he used to support his demagoguery was sufficiently compelling to justify it. He was a smart guy. He wasn't just making off-the-cuff remarks saying this person sucks, I don't like them, they shouldn't be president. He developed a real argument for why the Jeffersonians, if they got power, constituted a genuine threat. I don't necessarily agree with his argument. I think Jefferson was in some ways a good force for the country. There's reasons you can give that, at least in respect to the Federalists. But the question is there a real argument that you can try to verify using your reason? And in the case of Chase, I argue that there was. I'll end by raising a couple of questions that might be worth thinking about going forward, whether we talk about them here or just for your own edification. So one qualification I put in my book is that while I don't talk about other political and constitutional contexts, I think that the framework I develop in my book can be applied to other contexts. What you would need to do is think about the different political structures and institutions that exist in other countries besides the United States and try to derive from them a similar set of evaluative or analytical elements. So for example, if you were looking at the British Constitution and thinking about perhaps the recent Prime Minister election, you might think, well, how is the British Parliament designed to pursue substantive goods, right? As distinct from a separation of power system like we have in the United States. And you'd have to go through that exercise in order to try to come up with similar criteria for what does it mean to be a good member of parliament, right? What does it mean to be a good prime minister as distinct from what does it mean to be a good United States president? The offices are designed differently. They have many of the same powers and authorities, but the offices are designed differently. The selection process is different. So you need to work through all of those details. A second thing I think is worth thinking about, which I mentioned at the beginning, and I'm going to continue to think about going forward in my research, is how do weaponizable, insofar as that's a word, weaponizable concepts like demagoguery, like populism, like maybe tyrant, authoritarian. Political scientists try to use authoritarian in a neutral way, but it always has a kind of normative baggage to it. How does the use of those concepts in political discourse impact political discourse? That is, how does it actually change outcomes? Can we study the way in which it changes outcomes? I pursue this question a bit in the book in looking at this historical figure, Daniel Shays, Shays's Rebellion of fame. Some of you may have heard about this. The historians among us may have heard about this. The so-called Shays's Rebellion was a series of agrarian insurrections in western Massachusetts in the late 18th century. And this person, Daniel Shays, who was a real-life historical person, ended up getting saddled with the reputation as the guy who actually provoked Shays' Rebellion, who actually got the whole thing started. He was labeled a demagogue, right? There was this negative concept out there, and elites at the time seized on that concept and deployed it as a way of discrediting Shays. And that vernacular has sort of entered our political discourse and continues to shape the way we think about American politics. For example, in Intro to American courses and in AP Gov courses all the way down, we're often taught that Shays' Rebellion was led by this rabble-rouser Shays, and that the Constitution was designed and implemented as a way of suppressing that kind of egalitarian movement, right? Well, is that the right way to think about it? Well, it turns out Shays didn't do any of the things he was actually accused of doing. He was a kind of construct used by elites in Massachusetts and at the federal level to justify repressive measures. He was basically a fictive tool for elites who didn't want their power challenged. And so one question I would have going forward is, can we see similar dynamics play out with weaponizable concepts in other respects? You might think about the McCarthy era and the use of communism, the leverage that word, that concept did for that movement we were thinking about.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.